So, welcome everybody online and the few of us who've made it to Imperial College. And I know we're all wondering what's going to happen at 7 o'clock UK time, England versus Wales. But for the moment, we have two quite excellent speakers for you today. And I will, with great pleasure, introduce our first speaker, Elizabeth Coffey, who is a distinguished lecturer. And the name of her talk is How do CEOs Lead for Success? Insights to boost your leadership skills. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm delighted to be here with all of you today. And so I wanted to start by saying a thank you to the SPE Foundation, whose members are the primary funders. They get extra contributions from offshore Europe. And indeed, we're particularly grateful for members of the SPE allowing people who are their members to come and leave their jobs and take some time out to do these distinguished lectures, talks. We know that additional support has been funding by AIME as well. So today I'm going to talk about how CEOs lead for success. And I'm hoping that you're going to be able to take some tips away for this. My work for the last 25 years has been in developing chief executives and board level executives. And through that, I've become aware of what CEOs do. We have some sense of what the life cycle is, which is relatively short for them to do that. And then I'm going to focus in on what are the essential skills that CEOs bring. And then talk a little bit about how to accelerate your own leadership. So first, let's look at what they actually do. So what a CEO does when he or she comes into an organization is they first look at what is working well, what do they need to preserve. Secondly, they look at what's not working. What do they actually need to disrupt or stop? And the third thing is actually what do they need to create or innovate in that organization? And you'll see in this model that I have empathy in the middle, because in fact, they have to be thinking about where to aim their empathy. Some CEOs aim it across the board. They'll aim it down into their staff. They'll aim it out to their customers, to the shareholders. But some organizations, let's say an Amazon or a Walmart, they might focus in on, for example, the customer, getting the best prices for the customer, and others may have not as much empathy. Wall Street historically has focused on the investors, the shareholders. So where you choose to focus your empathy is an important part of who you are and what legacy you're going to lead in your organization. So to give you some understanding of what do I mean by these things, let's start by looking at some leaders that are famous for doing some of this stuff. So on the left-hand side, we have Nelson Mandela, obviously a disruptor of apartheid. And on the right, Vicky Hulub, who is the CEO of Oxy. Vicky was a disruptor in a couple of senses. First of all, as the first woman of a major petrochemicals organization, she was bringing a kind of female style to the boardroom, which had not been seen. So she was disrupting what people were expecting from a leadership style perspective. But secondly, she has chosen in the last few years to move the organization towards carbon capture and sequestration. So she's really kind of shifted strategy, which is a disruptive move in the industry. When we look at preservers, they're often people that are less obvious. They're people who are often less well known. And so on the left-hand side, we've got Indra Nooyi, who was until very recently the CEO of Pepsi, and Angela Merkel, who has been the 16-year head of Germany. And both of them preservers, trying to kind of keep things steady. I think Merkel I've seen and admired from afar for her steady hand in trying to keep Germany safe, keep Europe safe for the period of time that she was in power. In terms of creators or innovators, these are people who tend to be very famous. So Elon Musk, who's probably in the news every day around the world, everybody knows him for SpaceX, for Tesla, and more recently for his acquisition of Twitter. And we're all kind of watching to see what happens next in that story. On the right-hand side, somebody who is perhaps less well known at the moment, a scientist based in Oxford who, in fact, came up with the formula for what became the AstraZeneca medication for all of us for COVID. And you'll see here that Barbie has decided that they want to create some dolls in the shape of females in STEM. So here's a version of Professor Sarah Gilbert in small. And finally, empathy. On the left-hand side, Oprah Winfrey, probably somebody who has created her entire fortune on the back of her empathy in her media organization. And you'll see in the middle and on the right, we have Amin Nasser, the head of Saudi Aramco, in two different outfits. And I'm putting these here because you'll see in the center that he's actually wearing a traditional outfit from Saudi. This would be what he would wear if he were actually at home and welcoming people to Saudi in a meeting. But when he's leaving Saudi and going to kind of meetings in the West or other parts of the world, he's wearing a kind of Western style business suit. It's another form of showing your empathy with those around you. So I want to kind of go back to really early days when this gentleman, John D. Rockefeller, actually started Standard Oil, which I know is really, he's almost like the grandfather of this industry in the United States. And he basically did all of these things. So I want to kind of just pick up on a few of the things that he did. So he was definitely somebody who was preserving. He was he came from a background that was poor, so he was very careful with money. And in his company, he was also very careful and got everybody to be focused on efficiency drives. But what did he use that money that he saved for? To try to squeeze out and disrupt the marketplace, squeeze out competitors, buy up competitors. And through that price, through that plus price cuts for the customers, he was able to really, kind of massively expand the market. He bankrupted his competitors and would often just acquire them so that he actually sort of created this very dominant position for himself. In addition to that, he was a pioneer, so he was an innovator. He was creating. So he created the first monopoly. In those days, it was illegal to have a company that would run across all of the 50 states. So you had to open up a different company in each of the states. And so he had 41 companies across the United States in those days. He created more than 300 byproducts, and also, for the first time really in history, integrated the supply chain. So this is a phrase we have now, but honestly, back in the day when he was actually doing this, it was not a concept and they didn't have a phrasing for it. But then in terms of empathy, when he started to make his fortune, he actually started to become a big philanthropist, and he was giving to science, to the arts, and to education in big, big numbers. So for me, who's not an engineer, I got to know of him through his philanthropic work, and you'll see him here on the left-hand side, a painting of him by one of the most famous painters of the day, John Singer Sargent. But many arts organizations in the United States have huge funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, and he really defined kind of how people give. Interestingly, he came from a religious Christian family where from the age of 16, he was a bookkeeper, and his mother actually got him used to the idea of giving away 10% of his income every year. So even when he wasn't as wealthy as he was in the end, he was doing that from the beginning. So now we're going to look at the life cycle of the CEO. And here you'll see the kind of, you'll see Bill Gates kind of entering at the age of 19, starting Microsoft over a more than 20-year period, changing the industry, in line with the environment, anticipating market shifts, changing the market himself, and then again, moving into philanthropy and creating a sense of legacy, as we saw with Rockefeller. And for the last 20 years or so, Gates is really probably most famous for the work that he's been doing in Africa and India, in places, again, trying to eradicate disease, but also working with education. So he has this kind of arc from the time he's 19 until modern day. This is a very typical thing that happens, the enter, change, and legacy. And I want to look a little bit more at what CEOs have to do. So on average, we're looking at a median CEO tenure of about 5 years, according to PricewaterhouseCoopers in 2020. If you think about that, if you're running a really large organization and you're trying to introduce change, change will take probably 18 months for the shortest changes, 2 years or more on average, really. So that what you're looking at there is 2 cycles, if you're lucky, of that kind of a change. So let's see, like, what does that actually break down into? So in the beginning, you walk into a place, let's say you're hired from a different organization, and you've got about 100 days to get to that platform of 100 days to actually understand what's going on in the organization, what's going well that you need to preserve, what's going terribly that you need to stop, what do you actually need to introduce that hasn't been done before, and where do you need to aim that empathy that maybe has been underloved or underserved until now. So you formulate a plan at that stage, and you're ready to press the button at that point. So you start to make change, which then creates this turbulence. And if you stabilize the organization and you make it through that turbulence, then you usually are in a position where people say, hey, could you come back and do that again? And then you go through it again. So by the time you finish 2 cycles of that, that's about 5 years. And so it's kind of like, okay, what actually happens to push people out? Let's have a quick look at that. But first, let's look at somebody who did this enter and change piece, which is Lord John Brown, who we're in London right now. So this is where the headquarters of BP is. And John Brown had was educated at Oxbridge and then went straight from there into BP. So his entire career really was there. BP had a program where they would send people across departments, across parts of the world. So John had a very broad experience before he was actually invited to be the CEO in 1995. And again, thinking about the kind of Rockefeller, he cut the cost very aggressively as part of this. And so, you know, part of this was actually having impact then on infrastructure, not just within the company, but in the assets that they were owning or renting. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, because sometimes when you cut too deep, problems arise. But in addition, one of the things he did was he, in a cost-cutting initiative, he eliminated the layer of leaders below him. Now, I know this because I was working in companies in London that were pulled in to try to accelerate the leaders in the layer below. But if you have an entire generation of people who are gone, missing, you can't accelerate those things very fast. We're talking about maturity, we're talking about wisdom, we're talking about people management skills, people leadership skills, which you cannot just quickly, it's not like learning something fast on Google. So as a result, it helped because there weren't very many people to challenge him. So from that point of view, it's a kind of, you know, it's an interesting thing to do. It does cut out a lot of money, because usually those populations are the most expensive in an organization, but it leaves the organization a bit exposed, and we'll see what happens as part of that. Now, John was very early on to understand the importance of the Green Revolution, and he rebranded actually to Beyond Petroleum for BP much earlier than most people understood the importance of green. So in terms of like looking at his legacy, one of the things he did was he actually went on a kind of buying spree, and so organizations like Amoco were acquired during that period of time, and he indeed quadrupled the value of the organization. So from a financial point of view, the shareholders would have been very happy about that. However, some of the cost cutting actually had impact in places like the Texas City refinery, and will kind of, and further legacy actually as well. So that was a terrible disaster where people were killed and many people were injured as well. But here's something that, again, in London is very familiar to us, the National Portrait Gallery. He set up the kind of BP Portrait Award as an annual event for them. So he's kind of got a similar sort of pattern. Now, one of the things that happened, he had a kind of personal scandal that hit the newspapers and he was pushed out. And so if we kind of then look at what are the things that make people fail, I want you to kind of think about where you think his failure came in. So these are the 4 things that we know from research at Versa Delta. The CEO over the edge to the point where they have to resign. So you may have inherited a legacy where it's kind of impossible to actually fix it. And I think, you know, some people might look at some of the political situations that are happening around the world today and say, you know, there are certain kinds of premierships that you wouldn't want to have. You would not want to go into the leadership role because it's an impossible task, right? So that's one of them. A second one is that the selection process might have been wrong. Maybe they hired a person who was great for growth and expansion, and then the market shifted and you need somebody who's a cost cutter. Selection process problem. The third is that there are traps of the CEO office. The longer people stay in a position like CEO, which is kind of like a king or queen, people start to tell you all the time how great you are. And after a while, you start believing it. So you're kind of living in a little bit of a cloud and not necessarily fully in touch with reality. And that often leads to flawed actions of the CEO. So I think, you know, in the case of John Brown, we had a little bit of this going on with his personal situation. Things then meant he had a few flawed actions, which led to a tipping point, and he resigned. So what happened after that? Well, there were 2 people actually who were potential successors that have been identified. But remember, this layer had been taken out below him. So Tony Hayward was one of the 2, and he actually stepped up and was put in position. However, very shortly after he arrived, within less than 3 years, the Deepwater Horizon situation occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. Now that has been attributed to a lack of investment in the assets. So here was a situation where Tony Hayward kind of inherited this legacy and happened to be there when things started to fall apart. But in addition to that, part of what happened was that even though he was only there for 3 years, he started to kind of have that sense of traps of the CEO and kind of overblown ego. And actually, this quote from him, which is very well known, the disaster happened. People were killed, many people were hospitalized, but the Gulf of Mexico for weeks on end was having oil pumped into it. The wildlife was dying, fish, birds, and he was basically in front of the media all the time. Like, he didn't think this was going to be his job, but that's what it turned out to be. And he made this quote, "There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. I'd like my life back." So that was within about a month of the disaster happening. And that kind of a quote, you can imagine, just rang the wrong bells. It was like, don't you have empathy with the people who've lost their family members or are in the hospital, or people who are looking at those waves on the shore and can see how terrible this kind of eco disaster is. So he had traps of the CEO office, which then led to these kind of flawed CEO actions, which was a tipping point. And right after he said that, basically, he was asked to not do the media work. Somebody else stepped in to do the media work. And within 3 months, there was a replacement for the CEO put in place. So this is kind of giving you some sense of what goes wrong when CEOs leave. We're now going to look at some of the essential CEO skills. So here is Dr. Fatih Birol, who is the head of the International Energy Agency. And one of the things that he has been focused on recently is to try to put a roadmap in place for the entire industry to reach net zero by 2050. So for the whole global energy sector, he has kind of done this work, and he's out really campaigning to try to make big change happen in the industry. So big change part of the reason I'm saying this is because what CEOs do is they craft and then lead really big change. Well, here's one that we all know about, that we all know needs to be done. So what do you need to do to align stakeholders to get change to happen, which is pretty much what he's trying to do, but every CEO has to do when they make changes in their own organization. The primary skill base that you need is, we'll take one step back from that. When people think about CEOs, they tend to think of a CEO here at the top of a pyramidal organization, looking down and working with the executives that report to them, and then doing work for large-scale change with the employee population. But the reality of a CEO of any kind of large organization is that a CEO is actually spending their time influencing the stakeholder population, most of which is outside the organization. So first and foremost, the CEO is managing and influencing the chair and the board of trustees. Secondly, there are shareholders, investors, and then beyond that, a wide range of stakeholders. So let's look at some of these stakeholders. So you'll have, the policymakers, you'll have the regulators, you'll have the media, you'll have investors, you'll have strategic partners, and indeed suppliers. So there's a massive population, and I would say that the majority of the time of the CEO, and certainly my client base, is spent influencing up and out. And yes, they do spend some time in there, but in my experience, it's about 20% of their time. The majority of their time, 60% according to McKinsey's research, 80% according to my lived experience, is spent navigating and influencing that population. So let's have a look. In the industry, here's a kind of beautiful image of two countries and the premiers of these countries and people who are heading up two of the gas companies, one in each, Russia and China, coming together to sign a deal. And you can see in this that there would have been influence happening here, there would have been influence happening here, here, and here. So to get a deal like this is all about the strategic influencing. And this is really, in my experience, the single most important skill that you need to be a successful CEO, to get there and to stay there. Here's a person I've had the pleasure of working with, CJ Warner, who was at the time the head of refining globally for BP when I was working with her. She's now the CEO of Renewable Energy Group. And the reason I have her here is because of all the people I've ever worked with, she was the most beloved team leader. So choosing your team is really important, but inspiring loyalty from those team members is massively important, especially when you have really difficult things to do in short periods of time. You'll see she's recently, in 2020, been named as Fortune's Business Person of the Year. I had a question actually while I was on my last distinguished lecture tour of why is that? And part of it is she has a personality which is very warm, very collaborative, very caring, and she is authentically herself, very ethical, and kind of likes people, and people can feel that. So people like being around her, people like working for her. In looking at how to accelerate your leadership, I have a few suggestions. So here we have Sir Mark Moody Stewart, who was for a lengthy period of time the Group MD and chair of Royal Dutch Shell, and somebody who was really focused on the ethics of leadership, and also being kind of having a sense of your own authenticity, but holding your values close and living those values. I happened to sit next to him at a dinner a few years back, and he told me that one way that this came to life for him was that he was heading up a country for Shell, which will remain nameless. And as he and his family were coming back in after a holiday, they were stopped and their passports were taken away, and they were basically put into holding cells at the airport because people wanted to be paid to give them their passports back. So Shell had a policy of no bribes, pay no bribes, but it was also against his own personal ethos. So they said, well, we'll wait. and the family was released, but he was held overnight. So after a day of sitting and waiting, the family went back. I'm guessing that his wife must have got the legal representation for Shell. And the next day he was released. But this kind of sense of, we don't do this. You know, this is not how we function. So it's kind of holding your values, being clear about your values, and making sure that you live those values is a really important part of being an authentic leader. Meg is not a leader from the oil and gas industry. She was the CEO of eBay and then Hewlett Packard. She's a non-engineer, so the first engineer to hold either one of those kind of positions. And how could somebody who's not an engineer lead these kind of companies? It's because she is a learner and she's humble and she knows that she knows certain things, but other people know stuff that she needs to know. So she's constantly seeking out learning. And if you read about her at all, there's this kind of, this sense of being willing to be collaborative, but actually recognizing I have things to offer, but I know you do too. What is it? Please tell me, help me. So she has a kind of a style that actually is emblematic of that. With eBay, she actually grew the organization from a 4 million valuation in 1998 within 10 years to 8 billion. So she's doing something right. Here's somebody else that I have had the pleasure of working with, Taiba Al-Hashmi. Taiba was one of the first CEOs in the Gulf region in the industry, and I helped move her and another woman up into the CEO roles at ADNOC. She's heading up sour gas business at the moment, and when we were first beginning to work, before she actually was elevated to the position of CEO, we talked about how many sponsors she had in the all-male 22 group of leaders. Because part of what you have to be thinking about is, what are people saying about you when you're not in the room? And because the leaders were going to be taking the decision about whether or not she was appointed as CEO, it was very important that people knew who she was and actually thought well of her so that they would be speaking well of her. And one of her colleagues actually said to me, a man had said to me, that 7 is the magic number. Because I've done a lot of work with very senior women over the decades. And one of the things I've seen as a fail is there's one fantastic sponsor, maybe the chairman, maybe the CEO, who absolutely gets who this woman is and helps move her up. And when he retires or he moves on, there's nobody. So it's very important to have people talking who know who you are, who like what you do, and are actually talking about you when you're not in the room. This is particularly difficult, as you can imagine, in a culture which is gender segregated, like the UAE, because the only place that she could be making an impression on people was in the work environment, not anywhere outside the building. So an extraordinary leader in many ways, so I'm sure we're going to all be seeing more of over time. And finally, I want to come back to you and get you to be thinking about these things for yourself and thinking about the situation that you're in, what you need to preserve, what you need to be disrupting, what you need to be creating or innovating, and where indeed your empathy is going to be going to get the legacy that you actually want to leave. Thank you. And we want to get feedback from you, so please click the link below the video and fill in your questionnaire.
Thank you very much indeed, Liz. That's fascinating and rather inspiring. Those who are online, you should find a link partly sent to you by Kate McMillan about an hour and a half ago, but also at the bottom of the YouTube screen that you're looking at. So if you want to ask a question, if you can just complete the form and I'll see it and I'll read out your question as soon as I receive it. Thank you. And for those who are physically in the room, then if you want to ask a question, now's the time.
No pressure.
You mentioned 7 as a magic number. So, I'm sorry, my name is Brenda. I'm so sorry. I mean, very late. I missed most of it, but one of the first, I think it was the last flicked one because you mentioned 7 was a magic number. Was it?
Yes, so I don't know why 7 is the magic number, but I was told this by a very successful man who was actually an advisor to the group CEO of the organization and had based his own career progression on this basis. So in her case, it was 7 male leaders. In the case of you, maybe that's not going to all be male leaders, but in that particular case, it was. So sorry about that, but I can't really give you a good answer to that.
Just question again, Mr. Marcus. Just speak. Please. Hello.
There we go.
Okay, my question is, as a CEO,
Yes.
so let's say you're CEO and you're trying to introduce maybe some new ideas or philosophies to just basically introduce change to the company.
Yeah.
And you have employees who are not aligned with those changes, who actually do not see a good reason for embarking on that change. Well, what do you do as a CEO to convince them to see your ideas when you know that that's actually what is right for the company?
So I'm gonna go to here, right? Because we're back to strategic influencing. So this is about communication skills and in particular strategic influencing skills. I mean, people in general, humans do not like change. They tend to shy away from change, particularly in their own lives. So they have to have a good reason. And as a CEO, you need to know that. So you have to be thinking about this in terms of general issues like having a vision and a strategy kind of path to achieving that. But you also have to be thinking about different populations within your organization because some people may chime with the vision, others may not. You need to be thinking about how to communicate with the people who may be reluctant. Understand things that are going to actually change that will help them, that are going to work with their own agenda, and then speak to them about it and get people who are in your direct report group also speaking to their teams and so on. The cascading of the messaging has to go down because the CEO can't speak to everybody in a company of 2,000, 10,000, 50,000 people. So you have to make sure that the team working with you is aligned, but then that they are messaging down and not just rote messages. They have to really understand why are we doing this and then get on board with it. So there's a kind of first piece which is about communications. There's a second which is at a certain point when you're going down that path, you may find some people are just not going to go along with the journey. They don't want to do it. They'll do things to stop it. And at that point, you have to, as a leader, not just the CEO, but as a senior leader or a leader in the organization, identify this person's not going to be able to come on the journey. We tried to communicate, we tried to actually get alignment, and they don't want to come. So at a certain point, you need to have a conversation around, is this going to be the right place for you going forward? Because it's a terrible thing to be in an organization where everybody's moving in one direction and these 5 people aren't and are trying to block it. That's just not going to work. So you have to, at a certain point, understand it's a form of disruption, right? It's a form of understanding, we tried this, we tried this, we tried this. We've given them time. They're not on board. We need to say goodbye. So that requires you to be sort of tough and recognize it's time to disrupt.
Thank you very much for the great presentation. Sure. The other day, I read an article, I don't remember what it was. But that was about female CEO, and that was called something like myth phenomena. So basically, there was a study about female CEO coming, taking the role in when the companies were in position of pricing,
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah.
And once recovered, the company recovered, that they just, most of them resigned. And
The women resigned.
the women resigned, basically not willing to continue taking the CEO position when the company was in a good position.
So, I mean, part of what I would say is that often, oftentimes you get, and I'm just going to go back to one of the slides here from the previous deck, this idea of inherited legacy, okay? Oftentimes what I have seen in 25 years is that an organization gets into a really bad situation for whatever reason. Maybe the market's terrible, maybe some bad decisions were taken before. But for whatever reason, you're inheriting as the incoming CEO a really difficult situation that in fact may not ever be fixed. And in this moment, this is when the minorities get invited to become the CEO. Sometimes it's women, sometimes it's people from a different ethnicity. There's a whole host of ways in which you can be different. But this is a kind of situation where there's a poison chalice, we would say in English, that if you drink from this, you're going to die. Even if you fix it, it's a situation, arguably, whoever takes on the prime ministership of the UK at this moment, it's a difficult situation. Are they going to survive that? I don't know. But you'll notice that in these situations, you often get the people who are the majority stepping back and encouraging minority people, whether they're women or from other minorities, to come in. So it's a very interesting moment. And I've seen this happen many, many times, where the inherited legacy is so difficult that it's like it's almost like from a fairy tale of turning, this room of straw into gold overnight. It's like, can you do that? And people who want that CEO-ship will sometimes step up and in to get that, because then you're going to be part of history. So you're in that situation, you deal with all of the difficulties of that because it's difficult. And are you going to succeed? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe you'll partially succeed, but it takes a brutal toll on you in the process. So I wouldn't be surprised, that a woman would step down or a minority would step down after that, because it's bruising. Yeah.
First of all, I'm a bit concerned that I don't have any questions through the web form, and I think I'm going to ask Luca if you can come and have a look at what it is you set up on this machine, just make sure I'm not missing questions that are coming in. But whilst you're doing that, I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions. I'll start with one, which is, it's clear from your presentation that you have advised or worked with CEOs from all sorts of different industries. And indeed, what you've done in your presentation is try and generalize some of the lessons that you've learned throughout that process. Could you make any comments about the different challenges for a CEO, perhaps in the oil and gas industry, to some of the other, maybe the IT industry stuff you've done? Can you discern how there's whether there are specific differences?
Well, yes, there are differences, and there are differences, first of all, because each industry is different on its own. But not only is the industry different, but the people who are drawn to working in that industry are different. So when you say, the oil and gas industry versus the kind of, let's say, general technology, you're still talking about engineers as the primary group there. And I'm going to actually bring somebody up again because, well, I'm not able to. So Meg Whitman, who was the CEO of eBay, it was a fascinating situation because she had a background in consumer branding. And at the point where the organization had 30 employees, 9 of whom were engineers, the founder knew he could not take that organization to success. And he needed somebody with that skill base. So she had come from Harvard Business School, Disney, Toys R Us, Procter & Gamble. So she had that kind of a background, not at all what you would think eBay would have, because they needed somebody with that knowledge of marketing, of humans, with high emotional intelligence to actually add a dimension to this and try to attract people to buy and sell online. So the platform was all created by engineers, but actually they needed a different kind of person to lead and really take it to where it could go. So when I say it's not just the industry, it's actually the kind of people that are in that industry. If I kind of say to you, I worked years ago with the research and development team at GlaxoSmithKline. And at the time they had a guy who was heading that up. So these are all people who have either medical degrees or else they're scientists, R&D scientists, but they're working in a pharmaceuticals company. So they care about people being healthy, people getting well. And he had a phrase at the time, which was when things were starting to get bogged down or people were going down a rabbit hole, he would say, the patient is waiting. And it was a way to tap into the value system of that population and remind them we need to get moving because they all cared about patients. And so if I said that phrase to people working at Google, some of them will care, some of them won't care, you know. So if I said that to people working in the retail sector, some of them will care. You have to really understand who is in front of me, who is my workforce, what do they care about? And then you actually need to be able to tap into that quickly and evoke in them that kind of drive. So I know I'm not quite answering the question as you say. I would say all CEOs face the stuff that I've actually talked about, but each industry has its own kinds of environments that it's dealing with, its own kind of competition issues it's dealing with. And most importantly, in my view, the staff are a particular type on average. Which means that you have to think carefully about who might, you know, going back to the point about motivation, how do you motivate people who are from different? Well, you have to be able to tap into what drives that group over there, what drives that group over there.
Whilst, is that better? Am I speaking? I'll tell you what, I'll speak a bit more loudly and hopefully then, yes, I'll pick up on your one. No, it's okay, you stay there so that that's good enough, yeah. So to an extent, your last answer has kind of given me an insight into the sorts of things that you're trying to invoke in the CEO. Without you giving us a lot of time to, can you kind of give us some insight into what you do when you walk into a CEO's office for the first time, having been engaged or in a discussion with a CEO? What's on your agenda to interact with that individual to an extent that you might be able to make some added value to his or her performance?
So if we're talking about the work I'm being asked to do, because I do several kinds of work, but let's say we're talking about CEO coaching, where I'm actually working specifically to help that leader be a better CEO. Let's talk about that. Generally, the most important thing that I want to understand is what is the context first. And then I need to understand what are the strategic challenges within that context that are confronting that CEO. And then I want to understand what are the strengths of that CEO, because that's going to be the platform from which we do the development work. You know, he or she is really good at these things. We're going to work from there to build up other things that will help him or her deal with the strategic challenges within this larger context. So that's what I would be looking for. What I also, of course, have to do, and I don't really do it consciously, to be honest with you, but I just have to do this, which is to create trust. This is a kind of work which is not psychotherapy, but it's very personal. And the person has to trust that I'm on their side. I'm not somebody else's spy. I'm not going to be reporting back to another person who's outside the room. I'm actually there to help them be more successful in their job. And that has to come across through the conversation very quickly, because otherwise they won't be honest. And if they're not honest, I can't really help them. So that's what I would be both looking for and also trying to get across.
Sort of related to that.
You wait until this gets close enough to you that we can all hear you.
Hope it seems Thank you. And what sort of advice or guidance would you give to a CEO who gets into the position and they're a bit disadvantaged, say in the sense that maybe they are less experienced or much younger or not very well known in the industry, or and they come in from that sort of angle of background? What sort of guidance would you give?
Yes, so one of the things I would say is that CEOs need as much help as they can get, whatever age or experience they have. And that is doubly so for somebody who's younger, less experienced, or not from the industry. So part of this is actually, yes, a CEO coach is a helpful thing. But actually what I would say is finding mentors who are perhaps chairs of other organizations, but in a similar industry, for example. Being clear about who in the organization, let's say in the first 1 or 2 rungs below you, are deep experts on things that you can go to educate yourself about things. And the primary thing I would say is, you have to create a really strong relationship with your own chair. Sometimes people want the chair to be your mentor, but it's complicated because in this culture and this kind of regulatory regime, a chair is both a guide as well as judging your performance. And if you're not doing well, they can actually get rid of you. So you have to be careful how you navigate that relationship. Many times there's people in the board, directors of the board, non-executives, who are incredibly knowledgeable, but also may have contacts in other fields who are going to be relevant in terms of, let's say, understanding trending that's going to impact your organization. So it becomes a matter of building relationships, learning, being open to learning, seeking out learning. And usually it's through others, through people, rather than going on a course. Yeah.
So we have an IT problem here. So Luke, yeah, okay, I checked my phone, but Luke, ultimately, if there are any questions, would you mind reading them out so that we are aware what they are? Okay, so whilst Luke is handling that process, one thing that was quite apparent from your slides was that you were dealing with people from quite different cultures. For example, there was a lady at Adnot. Can you talk a bit about the challenges of, you're clearly an American white citizen, about moving into a board which has quite different values and expectations?
Yes, so to pick up on that particular situation, I would say that I think that this is where that point about Meg Whitman's point about being humble is really important. Because if I'm a minority in a majority culture, it's really important for me to be able to understand what's happening around me and to try to fit in. And I know that with the World Cup going on, that's quite an aggressive statement perhaps for some, but I'm of the view that if people are inviting me to work in their culture, it's important for me to try to understand them and try to be generous and respectful with them. In that particular situation, it was very interesting because what I would say is that because of the gender segregation in that culture, it meant that I was not only working with senior women, but I was also teaching the top 75 women in the company on a regular basis. And so every month I was there. And after a very short period of time, I had a very interesting experience because I had a friend who was Western who I asked beforehand, should I get an abaya because all the women wear this black robe in Adnot, because it's a state-owned company and it's the uniform and it's traditional wear, for the women. So I actually said to him, do you think I should wear an abaya? And he said, no, be careful, cultural appropriation. So I said, okay, fine. I started then working with the senior women. I started teaching every month. And within a very short period of time, I think by the second month, the women started asking me to wear an abaya. The women that I was teaching, the women I was coaching, telling me, oh, Liz, you would look so nice in an abaya. I would love to go shopping for an abaya with you. I want to give you a gift of an abaya. And it wasn't one person, it was like 5, 6, 7 people saying this. So I thought, okay, this is clearly something they're inviting me to do. And the impression I had was, we feel a sense of community with each other and we feel you're a part of that. So we want you to look like us. So I bought an abaya. I started getting a lot of compliments from the women, from men from the local culture, as well as I would walk around. And one day I had an experience that I was walking across an open plan floor, and one of the men who was from the West saw me in this and said, oh, you're going native, in this really kind of sardonic, aggressive way. So I thought, this is probably not the choice that everybody would make. I made it for the reasons of feeling like the people from that community wanted me to be doing this, so I did it. But what I would say is, it was easier for me to be in that all-female company. When I did some work with the senior men, part of what we did was we got a very senior man who was an advisor to the top 22 men, who was well known by them, well respected, to work with me when I was doing some teaching with that senior group, as a kind of almost as a kind of somebody who had vetted me and was introducing me and was working with me, that he kind of was making it like it was okay for me to be there. So I had to be led very much by what the local people told me would work, because I didn't know. And so that this is where the humbleness comes in, and where you have to trust that people are on your side, building relationships, because I'm trying to do what's right for the company. And if they know that, they're going to try to help me do that. So I know that I've only gone into kind of one specific, but I think it gives you kind of a general sense of how I tend to try to make it work.
Thank you, Luca. We have 2 questions for you from the virtual audience. The first one is as follows: which leadership style is more effective to grow valuation and build trust?
Okay, well, this is a trick question, because the answer is really, it depends. Because it depends what kind of institution you're in. It depends upon what industry you're in. It depends upon what's happening in the culture around you as well. So I am definitely of the view, in general terms, that you need to have a situational leadership style, meaning you don't have one style. You have a multitude of styles available to you at any given moment. All of which are authentic, by the way, because not every situation demands the same reaction. And I'll give you an example. If you were in a place, a country, and I'm looking at Tom over here because Tom is traveling the world. Let's say you're in a culture where there's a souk or a bazaar, and you find a really beautiful carpet that you want to buy. And you don't want to be scalped. You don't want to pay too much for it. When you start to have a negotiation with the person who's selling that, part of the time you have to bring a style which is an appreciative style. This is such a beautiful carpet. I love the colors. My gosh, the design is so amazing, etc. At a certain point, that seller is going to try to see how much he can get out of you, or how much he can get out of you. And you want to put a marker down of, you're not going to scalp me. So your tone shifts. And you start to say, I'll offer you this. And there's a different, it's not the kind Tom who's actually doing that. It's the tough Tom, it's the negotiator Tom. And at any given moment, you have to evaluate, how much further can I push this with that person? So your style has to flex and move in the moment, depending upon what is necessary for that particular situation. So you buy something that's beautiful for you and don't overpay. Okay, so this kind of idea that there is a perfect style, no, there is not. Are there trends in style? Yes. Part of what I would say is right now, there's very much a kind of push for collaborative leadership, for people being kind of teamy in the way that they work. And right now, in this particular moment in history, we're getting, if you read Harvard Business Review or lots of other management work, they'll be often talking about the benefits of this kind of thing. But indeed, if you're a general, working in the field of battle, you don't have time to collaborate or even consult. And you have to be directive, and you need to be clear, and you need to be concise, and, say, we need to leave this building now, go, So there is not an easy answer. It's a complicated answer. It's very situational.
Okay. Excellent, very interesting. So we have another question from the virtual audience. Do you think the best CEOs to address the energy transition have to be selected to do that specifically?
Short answer, no. The slightly longer answer, we need to have CEOs who look up and see what's happening in the world today and recognize the urgency for all of the institutions to be taking action, particularly ones like in this industry where there is a heavy burden put on this industry to change. So what we need is CEOs who see that need for change and who have that capability to change and recognize the urgency of that and start to marshal the forces. I don't think that has to mean everybody who's in a CEO job that in this industry that has been there for 5 years needs to be replaced. No, I don't. It's about actually recognizing what's necessary and marshaling their forces to make that happen.
Okay, well, just to ask Luca, are there any more questions that you want to share with me or to read out yourself? I've got just those two, is it? Okay, so are there any more questions from the physical audience? Anyone else like to ask? Okay, right.
So as far as, I know you had a slide up there with a big heat on it with Oxy. Where would you say she's in the life cycle of being a CEO? Whether it be something that's she may get another 5-year term or something like that. Just your thoughts on it.
I don't know the situation well enough to be able to make a definitive statement about that for those who are investors in Oxy. However, I think that, to go to the point that Tim just made about do leaders have to be replaced to be able to address the climate change issues? No. She has looked at the history of this organization. She's chosen a strategic path that actually begins to really tackle the issues. And I think that what happens, of course, in these situations is all eyes are on her because she's leading the charge, disrupting. And so it's going to be one of these situations where people are going to be looking for successes, hooray, but they're also going to be following very carefully any missteps, anything that she could be blamed for. It's one of the things that happens, to your point before, right? That when you're in that situation, you're very, very visible. So people see the good stuff and people see the bad stuff and everything gets magnified. So I am hoping, I'm going to put hope into this. I'm hoping that she's really successful and that the stumbles are small and that this gathers pace because it's clearly going to be something that's going to be fantastic for the world, actually.
Okay, well, as far as I know, Luca, we've no more questions from our virtual audience. Does anybody else here want any final remark, final statement? Would it, we have to say thank you so very much indeed for a fascinating insight into this elevated role that you described to us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And I think we'll reconvene at 7:15 to give us an hour. I appreciate that the university match is on, but if you wish to listen to Tom Emelander, then he'll be starting his talk 10 past or 7:15. Thank you very much, everybody. See you soon.
We're good?
We're good.
All right.
Okay, so I will, okay, so those of you who decided not to watch the England versus Wales game, or rather have it on your other screens and laptops, I'm delighted to welcome you back and also to introduce our second speaker, Tom. So Tom is going to talk to us about sidetracking with whipstocks, an efficient method for increasing your operational and asset value. And a little bit about Tom. Sorry, I forgot to give a little about you. Tom Emelander is product line manager for Weatherford's whipstock system. His early career focused on support and implementation of casing exit technologies. After gaining operational experience, he was elevated to technical specialist, where he guided his team to significant improvements in surface quality. Regarded as a subject matter expert, he has authored multiple technical papers and industry articles. Tom, the floor is yours, but first I would remind people online that if you click the link at the bottom of the YouTube screen, you will find a way of asking questions, and then either I or Luca will find them and read those out to Tom. Tom, the floor is yours.
Excellent, thanks. Glad to be here, especially for the occasion of the World Cup game. As you introduced, I'll be talking about whipstocks, how they can add value to your operation. I work with Weatherford, product line manager, been doing some role with whipstocks and sidetracking for about 15 years now. So we'll dive right into it. The agenda for this evening is basically going to be defining sidetracking, the reasons why people sidetrack wells. It's changed quite a bit over the past couple of years that I've been involved with this. And we'll talk about what whipstocks actually are. Got to understand that before we can move on.
Yeah.
But better?
Yeah.
Okay. The alternatives for sidetracking, first using whipstocks, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation, which will be talking about the evolution, not only just, I guess, in the past 10 or 20 years, but since the start of whipstocking altogether. And then we'll touch a little bit on how sidetracking with whipstocks has changed the industry in contingency type scenarios, and how it's de-risked some of the decision-making that operators have doing the well construction process. A real high-level overlook on multilaterals and reentries, and then we'll finish it up with open hole whipstock. So as we go through this, if there's any questions here in the room, we can keep it somewhat informal and you can stop and we can go over it. So the definition of sidetracking, quite plainly, just like what it sounds like, a main wellbore, and anytime you deviate off that main wellbore, whether it's a directional or vertical, that's considered a sidetrack, right? So nothing groundbreaking there. Sidetracks with diverters have been done since the 1920s and 1930s. Started off in California to target some of the offshore reserves using land rigs. So diverters to get behind pipe reserves. Some of the drivers for why operators sidetrack nowadays, there's a lot of them up there. The obvious one being what they were first used for, to get offshore reserves from land rigs. But if you look at where we're at now, it's looked at for a lot of geothermal applications where there's multiple legs to complete the closed loop and open loop systems. Dozens of multi-lats being planned by some of those particular drillers that are in geothermal. And then regulatory is another really big one. Speaking about certain areas of the world where they permitting to get new drills are difficult. Some of the areas, the only thing you can do to drill a well is to re-enter sidetracking. So that's a couple of the reasons. And then of course, there's always the obvious ones, contingency based. So sidetracking around an impasse. So you're drilling a well, something happens, missed a target, got a fish stuck, something like that, and you have to go around it. That's kind of the old reliable method, right? So multiple reasons, those are just a couple. So we have to understand what a whipstock is before we continue. So there's three different parts to a whipstock, of course. There's the anchor, there's the actual trough of the whipstock itself, which is your actual deflector, and then your method of deployment. As shown on the screen, it's deployed on mills. So very close to 100% of the systems that are ran in casing are deployed on mills nowadays, so that you can single trip, get the window in the same process as you set the whipstock. But we'll start at the bottom and work our way up whole. The anchoring devices can be either mechanical or hydraulic, right? You gotta have a way to anchor it. Same goes for casing as open hole. You gotta have a method of anchoring. Mechanical devices, you have to have a false bottom, right? So you gotta have something to set on. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you can activate the anchor, it sets, you're good. Hydraulic, you can be anywhere in the wellbore, you don't have to be close to a bottom. And then the actual deflection device itself varies on length depending on what size casing you're in. So if you're in a smaller size casing, it's going to be shorter. Okay. It also varies by application. Usually for the offshore wells, when you're cutting windows inside a casing, they try to maximize the window length to have a smaller dog leg or a deflection right there across that junction, the window junction itself. But they're limited on being able to put it between two collars. So it's kind of an industry guideline that you don't cut across casing joints. So as you get larger, your window gets larger, but at some point you have to stop because you don't want to be cutting across the connections in the casing. So usually if you're talking land-based systems, they're around that 3-degree angle. And when you're talking offshore, they typically will go to a 2-degree, which gets you a much smoother transition for the casing and the following BHAs. And then of course, the deployment method as shown here, mills, it can be running tools, things of that nature. But usually if it's going to be mills, you're going to run it on at least 2. The longer the window, usually you're running more mills, 3 or 4. And like I say, in casing, almost the vast majority are run on mills so that you can get on depth, point the slide the direction you want to go using any type of orientation method, anchor the system, and then detach the mills from the actual whipstock itself, hydraulically or mechanically, and then go ahead and cut your window in the casing to get you deflected for the following BHAs. So pretty straightforward, but that's the long and short of a whipstock. Alternatives. Of course, if you're drilling a well and you run into a problem, it's always an option. If you have the lease space to do it and the money and the time, you can drill a new well. Now, no one really wants to do that, but it's truly an option, right? Some people will do that. Of course, you have all the costs associated with getting that well down to where you were, and you have to have the acreage to do it, and you also have to have the cost associated with getting that next surface prep. Another alternative that's used to be kind of the only method of sidetracking before deflection devices come into play is section milling. And that still used in a lot of basins around the world, but for the most part, casing X's have taken over. So the reason why section milling has kind of gone to the wayside in a lot of the applications is because of the time it takes to do it. Instead of milling just a section of casing pointed in one direction, you actually remove entire sections of casing, the whole casing, right? Hundreds of feet in some cases. And it's not necessarily that you can't do that from a milling perspective, because of course it can be done. You have to have the fluid properties to get all that swarf out of the hole. Thousands of pounds of metal coming out, and then you have to deal with that surface. And usually the cost to do that is quite high. You have to have extensive mud programs to get all that swarf out. And then once you get your section milled, you have to go ahead and pump cement. Wait for that cement to set up. I hope it sets up good enough and then get sidetracked off. Time drilling usually. So when you look at it from a standpoint of simplicity, it seems reasonable, but once you start looking at the time it's going to take to do the whole operation, the economics slowly disappear and you end up going the route of the casing. So the evolution, even when I first got into the industry about 15 years ago, it was somewhat hit or miss on people getting windows in single trips, right? Not a lot of unique steam stuff being done as far as trip savings. Your goal, your KPI, if you will, your target was just to get a window, a usable window. Whether that took 1, 2, 3, or 4 trips wasn't really a big deal, but nowadays that is a big deal. It's all about trip reduction, total well possession time on the sidetrack being reduced to save the operators money, right? And along with that, is the ability to mill windows in all sorts of casing sizes, weights, and grades, right? The more options you have, the better it is for the operator, because it de-risks that whole section size when they do well construction. So nowadays, the target is single trip everything. Whether or not that's realistic in all cases can be argued, but at the end of the day, the expectation in most applications is to get these done in a single trip. And the reason why there's been advancement is from a fishing standpoint, whipstocks just used to be part of the kit. Hey, someone's out here cleaning my well out. You know, John ran whipstock, we'll call him. That's not the way. It's all competency based, and money has been spent to develop the technology. The same overshot that's used to fish a well today is the same one that was used 5 decades ago. That is not the case with whipstocks, right? It's changed significantly. I got some examples of that. So the long and short of it is, where we're at nowadays is essentially, if it exists, you can sidetrack it. You can put a window in it. So a couple of the examples, the through tubing exits that are done where you're tripping through reduced size pipe 3.5, 4.5, and then anchoring in sizes that are larger below it. That's the definition of through tubing. Those are some of the most technically challenging exits out there. For the reason is your mills are so small relative to the casing that you're cutting through. So the wall thickness to mill OD ratio starts to increase. And once you get above 10, things can get tough. But they do all the time. There are certain companies out there that have niche in that market that are really good. And then of course, slot recovery for casing sizes that are 20-inch, 30-inch up. There's plenty of companies out there that'll have whipstocks that actually stab down into the joint that they cut and leave at surface to where you can deflect your following drilling BHA. So I haven't heard of a situation where someone has called and said, hey, we need to do this, we need to sidetrack this, and the answer is, well, that can't be done. Usually nowadays it can. So when you look at it, I mentioned that it was kind of 50-50 on getting windows in a single trip, maybe not get usable windows at all. But where we're at with it now is because of the thousands, tens of thousands of exits that have been done over the past 5 decades worldwide. When you look at it from a 30,000-foot view, it usually takes about 3 or 4 days to do an exit. So from the time that the vendor shows up, service company, to the time you're back to drilling is very quick. And the reason for that is because of the trip count. 97% of the time in normal applications, you're getting windows in one trip, right? So where it used to take a week or 2, and then you find out maybe you don't even get a usable window, it's very well defined now because of all the exits that have been done. Everyone's got databases to pull the same examples and say, hey, we've done this 100 times, and this is the risk profile of it. So it's very unique. So some of the reasons why the efficiency has gone up so much is the systems themselves. They're true single trip systems, but in addition to that, if you look at it, the newer cutting structure that's out there, right? Whether it be a combination of carbide and PDC or straight PDC or all carbide, it seems like every couple of years there's a there's new development within those cutting structures that allow for windows to be cut quicker and also maintain gauge better, which at the end of the day is money back in the pocket for the operator. Utilizing real-time data acquisition when you're milling the windows, it's similar concept to watching the EDR while you're drilling the well. You can use that same type of technology where anyone worldwide can tune in and watch them mill a window, such as SMEs in the background, to make sure that everything is going as planned. MPT reduction tool as well. So if something does happen, you have more experts online to kind of get back to drilling quickly or milling quickly. So trip count on milling windows, kind of the direction that the industry is heading now, and I've got one example in here of that, is actually combining whipstocks, right? So normally before you make a whipstock run, you typically do a clean out run, like a wellbore preparation run, if you will, to make sure that the whip can get to depth, cleaning out any over torque collars and debris. do a mud change at that point if you need to before you cut the window, tag your false bottom to ensure you can set weight on it, those type of things. Well, the industry is going to the point where they're running sacrificial scrapers in mills or bits below the anchoring systems of the whipstock to do that well prep run with the whipstock. Right? So it's combining trips, and in deep water environment, that's substantial. Could be a day, and if you're talking a $700,000 a day spread without including production, they'll buy those scrapers and bits all day long, right? So here's just an example. I got this one from the UK because we're here, right? But this goes into low side sidetracks, meaning that if you're in inclination, the well bore has some inclination to it, you are actually cutting the window in the down direction. So I'll use 90 degrees, for example. If you're out in a lateral, anything that's both, from 90 to 180, that's going to be low side. Now, that used to be problematic, and it kind of was an industry guideline, you just don't do it. Well, because of the way the technology's gone and the drivers from an industry's perspective, that was a needed ability because of the wells being drilled. This is just one example of, mature field, no cement on the backside, which is very problematic. So you don't have anything there to hold you on. Gravity's going to help you get those mills out, and usually too earlier than what you would like. Well, because of this technology, they've developed a hinge that goes between the anchor and the concave, and they've pinned it back to the point where the whipstock would not fall and it would stay back against the wall. And just in this particular field here in the UK, you see the actual single trip success rate of the same installs looked at from a data perspective increased by 60%. Now 95 or 93% single trip success in a low side non-cemented application is that's massive. Like that wasn't happening even probably 5 or 6 years ago. So that's just one example. Another example, heavily involved with this exit myself. You won't see this casing size and weight anywhere else on planet Earth other than the Gulf of Mexico. So this is incredibly unique. It's 311.8 millimeter casing, and it's almost 200 kilograms per meter. And this is run down to almost 7,000 meters. So we're talking high pressure, high temperature. And when you look at it from a mill OD standpoint to wall thickness size, you're up in that 13% range. So it's above the 10% that we talked about. And up until, let's say 2018, this was not, it couldn't be done. It just couldn't be done. And this particular operator, super major, they run this casing size in one particular field of the Gulf of Mexico, and it's a high risk scenario, not only because of the depth and the weight of the pipe. It's a one-way trip. So when they run this in and they pass a certain depth, you're not pulling it back out, it's too heavy. So whatever happens, you're there with that casing. And could you imagine cutting and pulling this or section milling it? Not so much. So this was done, and it's been done multiple times since. So the reliability is there. And I say that to say this. If this can be done, a lot of things can be done, right? This is technically very challenging, even though it's only one string. But because it was done and it's been done multiple times, there's reliability to it now. It's changed the way that this operator can perceive the risk of running this casing size. Because the alternative is to come up hole, give up the whole hole section, and say cut a window in the 14-inch, which is not an easy task either. Then re-drill the whole hole section, and now you're buying more of this casing to put in the ground. So in this case, if you run into a problem, you have a reliable alternative versus that. You cut a window and you go around your problem. And because it's been done multiple times, and it's usually in that 4 to 5 day range, it changed the way that they will run this casing. They will drill more of these wells because the operation, the well construction operation, has been de-risked. That makes sense. One more.
And this goes, one more case here, at least for the new technology side of it. And this one I really wanted to put in here, not only because it's UK, but it talks to the new technology that's coming out commercially over the next, say, 6 to 18 months with the trip count reduced. Not from a milling standpoint, but the wellbore preparation standpoint. And so this particular system was field trialed here in the United Kingdom, offshore environment. And so you can see from the data that's pulled on the right-hand chart, just over 30 jobs. On some of these wells, there was well prep run, some of them there wasn't. But the long and short of it is, on the ones that were, when you average out the data, it comes into around a day of time saved. When across the whole project, when looking at both not making the trip or making the trip, now this is significant, right? Because you're combining the wellbore prep run, and across the board, you're saving about a day's worth of spread. Offshore, that's significant, right? It doesn't matter where you are on planet Earth, but it's the same concept of running to clean out equipment sacrificially below the anchor. A different mechanism, more of like a hydraulic release that allows you to work those BHAs down. You're not limited by shear bolt. Significant step change. And on top of the savings, rig floor makeup was reduced by 17%, and then you can trip fast because you're not limited by the shear bolt anymore. So it doesn't mean you can probably go wide open, but faster than what it usually was running the whipstock on a shear bolt, right? And you have the mechanism to clean the well out on the way. Any questions on that? Okay. So planned contingency. Because of the data we just went over that says, hey, you can do a sidetrack in 3 to 4 days, and 97% of the time you're going to fall within that time range. It's kind of changed the way that the industry has not only constructed wells, like I just talked about the 12.25 pipe, but also from the standpoint of when I first got into the industry, it was almost unheard of to run non-fishing friendly BHAs, OD fishable, right? But because there's a reliable option in there to sidetrack around it very quickly, 3 to 4 days, people are now saying, I'm willing to run newer technologies that are not OD fishable, knowing that it's not the end of the world if I can't get that out of the well, right? It's all about the thought of drilling that well quicker and longer. So longer laterals, getting the wells drilled quicker. Some of the examples would be high torque pipe, right? A lot of those in slim hole application, that's not OD fishable. That would not have been run 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Nowadays, people run it all over the world. And I think the reason for that is because the ROP gain in the lateral length that they get off running that pipe outweighs the risk of not being able to fish the pipe because you can go around it. So the efficiency of the operation has also, in my opinion, allowed operators the freedom to make decisions to use other technologies that the backup is to run the whipstock, right? And another example would be the RSS systems, the rotor steerables. A lot of times, depending on where those park downhole, they're absolutely not OD fishable, and it would take in some cases they're not ID fishable either. So then you just straight lose the option to fish it. But knowing that you can be back at drilling in 3.5 days, in most cases, it de-risks the choice. If you also look at it, when I got into the industry 15 years ago, you'd walk around the office and the stories of people out fishing for weeks on end, months on end. Guys got 4 Porsches in the garage, making all sorts of money, but that's not a thing anymore for the most part. Maybe a little bit on the production if you're work overside on land. But if you're talking fully operational drilling rig, and especially offshore, unless you are obligated to fish that for insurance reasons, or if you leave a source in the hole, you're probably not going to spend 3 months fishing that. And this is the story behind it. So everyone is very aware of the industry fishing equation that goes off of a cost of the operation to fish, the chance of success of fishing versus sidetracking. Well, we know, because we just went over the statistics for sidetracking. If you say, hey, I'm going to go do this, we can give you a very clear answer. The industry can and say, you're going to be this successful and it's going to take you this much time at the depth you're at. Done thousands of them. So that part of the equation is known and it's shifted because of the technology, and hole can be recovered so quickly, right? So the amount of, every time you log into some social media, there's a new record hit, some based around the world, whether it be because of the RSS or the drill bit, or this and that. You know, nowadays, it's not uncommon for people to drill 1,000 foot a day. So it shifted the perception of how long I'm gonna fish that well out to gain that footage back. The bottom line is that you can cut windows and drill faster than what you can fish in some scenarios. So that it's shifted the number of days justified to go out there and actually try to remediate a well. Conceptually, that's a huge thing. Here's another one. Kind of an example of a sidetrack around a collapsed casing impasse, but also this could absolutely be considered technically challenging because it is an expandable liner, right? So it's got a unique idea of 345.4 millimeter. So it also takes into account that there's technology out there to catch that size. That's not normal casing idea, right? So combining an off-the-shelf technology, maybe small modifications to quickly make that system capable of catching that unique casing size, but then also having to install that versus going up the whole section. So collapsed casing on the cement job, thin wall, overpressured, it's got a plug somewhere. Then fish that section up or remediate it, mill it out. The decision was just to go ahead and cut a window that was almost the size. Now, in this particular application, it was 3 trips because the mill size wasn't normal. And then you staged your way up. So once you got the first size window cut, 12.25 inch OD, I don't know if that converts you from millimeters, but then you ramped your way up 2 more runs to get up to the full casing ID. So planned 3-run job, executed flawlessly, using off-the-shelf equipment in an absolutely unique scenario, saved around 10 days of time and cost associated with coming back up a whole section, or probably longer trying to remediate. Probably wasn't even able to. So new technology, check the box there. Bypass collapsed casing. Good story. Now this is also unique. Diamond mine, Botswana, right? In this particular case, same situation, even though this was purely quarry into a diamond mine, it's well construction, whether it's geothermal or drilling for oil or gas or quarry for diamonds. It's all the same concept, right? Because of where they were at relative to surface, they were deep, and it's not a huge surprise in diamond mine, right, that the compressive strength was incredibly high. And they didn't even have in country open hole systems to set out in the open hole. So they decided, because the compressive strength of the formation was so high, that they would run a case bowl system inside open hole. So check the box, new technology, new slips, things like that. Single trip install at just over 1,200 meters. You can see the hole size there, but 310 megapascals dolomite. That's pretty tough. When you look at it from the standpoint of what their alternative was, because in this case, they're trying to core. If they don't get that, they weren't going to get the fish out of it all. They would have had to drill a new well because of it if they could sidetrack. Got to get the core on the diamond mine, right? 900 hours of rig time saved. Thankfully, this was a land rig. That's only $1 million US. That's offshore. That's 10 times that at least. So, and that doesn't include the drilling costs and the bits associated with getting through that hard formation. So incredibly unique, but it's a good story to paint from the standpoint of it doesn't need to just be oil and gas, right? Bypass fish. So multilats, we're going to hit this at a very high level. We just don't have the time to go into the weeds on it, but the definition of multilateral is similar to that of sidetrack, very simplistic. If there's more than one lateral, it's a multilateral well, right? So plenty of the wells that are drilled out there nowadays that are new drills or even re-entries would be multilats. If there was a lateral off before, that falls in that definition. So the whole conversation, when you start talking about multilateral wells or re-entries, is all about saving the well construction cost and time. getting down to recut your window. So it's like the window's the new wellhead, right? Because you're gaining that extra lateral worth of production, but you're saving the cost of the whole vertical section of the well. So that's the whole conversation, right? And the way operators look at it is it's a way to reduce their cost per foot of reservoir exposure. You're targeting the same lateral lengths, but you're not drilling the well through all the problem sections down to kickoff point. And if you look at it, some of the operators now are spending a little bit of extra money. The baby step is to spend a little bit of extra money on the front end from a well construction standpoint to set it up for future reentry, future multi-lat. The kind of leap of faith is buying up acreage that will allow you to do full on multi-lat projects down the road, right?
So, can I go back to the one? Can you hear me? Yeah. Go back to the previous one. It looks like you're sidetracking from both sides and then trying to meet them.
Yeah, that's a courtesy of Ever. So that would be geothermal. I'm sure you're aware.
I'm fully aware of it, yeah, no comments on that, but look at the well configuration is you're sidetracking from the first lateral in both cases, in both sides of the well.
Yep.
So how are you doing that?
So they'll use ranging equipment. So they'll drill they'll drill the well construction could vary on how they do both wells, but they'll intersect. So it's the same concept that they use for like the Macondo blowout that we, intersecting the well. And that's done on a regular basis in certain basins, especially not only for a geothermal standpoint, but a plug and abandonment reasons, right? So you have one lateral and then you'll put the equipment down there that'll send off signals. And as you get closer with the other lateral, it'll say, hey, you're this far away, and then you do a planned intersect.
You're using electronics to get those two sides of the well to touch each other. So is there a maximum temperature which those electronics would?
That's a good question. I think a lot of the tools out there right now, if you're talking about MWD tools and maybe like heat shielded gyros, I don't know of any personally that are above 500 F. But there's plenty out there that are lower than that, but it's still above 400 F. So the thing you have to think about though is when they're doing those type of operations, they have the ability to circulate. So that just has to be the actual temperature environment that you're in, well circulating. So if you have the ability to circulate, which usually you do with the MWDs, you can keep them cool with the fluid, the drilling fluids. So as long as you're not above those thresholds while you're circulating, you're in good shape. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Excellent. So talking to multiple super majors, the ones that do a lot of sidetracking and multilaterals, it's kind of a general consensus that around 50 to 60% of the time and cost of a well from start to finish completed is in the vertical section, or at least down to kickoff point. So when you're drilling a new well, kickoff point, at least in my mind, is where you start the curve. So it's the vertical section, well construction phase. When you're talking about sidetracking it or doing a reentry and multi-lat, where you cut the window is your new kickoff point, right? So you're saving that cost. I've already hammered that home, but it's just a perfect example of 50 to 60%. That's a significant amount of the well construction, right? And you're still getting the reserves that you wanted. So with a lot of the new technology out there, like the hydro pipes, the muds, the bits, everything that's used in well construction, a lot of these reserves that are at some point were bypassed because they weren't economical to get. Well, everyone goes after the low hanging fruit, but once that low hanging fruit's gone and you have a mature field, it just makes sense to say, hey, we left a reserve straight years ago. We can go access that now with the new technology. One of those being the fact that we can get you back to drilling in 4 days, or at least the whole process of creating your new window, which is the wellhead, right? So multilaterals, there's multiple ways to get reserves, but generally speaking, you can do that vertically. But in order to do that, you got to have a seam that's thick enough to do it, right? Or multiple zones of pay that are of interest. The other way to do it is to do it horizontally. But when you do it horizontally, you gotta have the acreage to be able to get it, right? So it's two food for thought type things to think about. How you do well construction and how you produce those wells also will depend on kind of the operator's philosophy on how to do it. But two examples would be all well construction at first. So new well, let's just say you're doing a stacked vertical multi-lat, you would go down and complete the first well like you normally would, come back up, cut a window, complete that second well like you normally would, and then start producing both of them after frac. Now, the problem with that, some would say, is that you're not getting a big return on your investment during the well construction phase if you were to do that a few times. The other option would be to treat it like a standalone well, complete it, produce it, and then at a later date, treat it like a more mature well, and come back onto it, sidetrack it, and get another avenue of production. So it depends on where you're at. One thing is for sure, there's lots of mature fields that are out there that you can utilize existing surface footprint infrastructure to re-enter to get behind reserves. Couple of examples. This is in the UK, it's a Tamil 2, which means that and most of the time, a lot of the land-based multi-lats are Tamil 2, meaning that the completion is dropped off outside of the junction so that you have access both to the lower bore and the sidetrack bores. I'm not going to get into the details on the different, but this is one example where it's Tamil 2, meaning that they've got the completion dropped off on the outside, but you can kind of see here in this particular case, it had to be a low risk option, which it definitely is a level 2 system because it was in a wildlife sanctuary and also kind of a surrounding recreational area. Had to be low cost, keep the trip count down. In this particular case, they set it up where they ran a big bore packer that had an orientation device off of it. So this was used as a fixed point of anchoring for all the whipstock operations that took place. So conceptually not groundbreaking. This technology has been around for a while. It's just you're using it now to stab whipstocks in and cut windows, and then you can use that philosophy to use that same anchoring mechanism and space out your windows. So cut a window in one joint above it, cut a window 2 joints above it, 3 joints, and so on and so forth, right? And in this particular case, you always have the ability to go and re-enter the lower zone and all the multi-lats if you need to install a diverter. With this particular setup, it's an option. Or you could use coil tubing kickover tools, or bed joints is the most common one. But in this particular case, 2 wells, 2 additional laterals, 177.8 millimeter casing, and they got economical production out of all of them, but they saved the cost down to that point, right? So it reduced the overall spend per foot of barrel of production, and they have re-entry capability to all of them. So it's a good success story, and it's done here in the UK. Now here's one that's not necessarily a similar concept from the standpoint of meters of lateral. This is significant. I don't know if anything's ever been done worldwide to this scale, but 18,000 meters of lateral for one well, coal seam. So that speaks to the vertical stack that I was talking about. You don't need to have necessarily the horizontal acreage to do it. You're just now cutting window after window after window. And usually in these cases, in this particular instance, once the lateral is drilled, they'll come back up and low side the directional BHA to do another lateral off of the lateral, not using deflection devices. So every well, it seems like that's in this particular basin, they set a new record every time they drill. It's significant. I mean, this is 18,000 meters off one well. Now, usually it's going to be 177.8 or 129.7 millimeter casing. That's in this particular field. And after they get done doing all the well construction, meaning that they'll set all the whipstocks. In this particular well, there were 6. And they had, I think, 2 more low side laterals off of it. They'll come in there after it's all done and retrieve all the whipstocks and the isolation barriers between each one. So it was all well construction first. then they pull everything to produce it all at once. Well, you can do that if it's all cold and it's all in the same seam because the pressure gradients are the same. Now, when this came on, this was significant, 12 to 15 million cubic feet a day. So the one thing you have to be mindful of, and this is a good example of it as well, is when you go in there and you're isolated between drilling the laterals and you pull those barriers, you have to be prepared that something's going to be on the backside. So you're going to have to go to well control mode in some of these instances. Okay. Any questions on this? This is unique, but the concept can be done anywhere worldwide where there's a thick enough coal seam.
So my observation was more because we're using a system like this, but when you've already produced some of the reserves, means you've got differential pressure between the different reservoirs.
That's right. And in that type of situation, you've got two options: run a higher end multilateral, so it's not a Tamil tube, where you have the completion set up to where you can handle the different pressure gradients, where it's not commingled, or you produce the pay zone on one of them down to where the pressure gradients become, where there's not a difference in them anymore. Is that kind of that's what you guys? Okay, yeah. So this doesn't fit all, but it's coal drilling is picking up because of the price of natural gas, and so this is a good success story of how you can reduce the carbon footprint, not necessarily by switching away from natural gas, but reducing all the cost and spend and the footprint that goes along with drilling multiple wells. So there's that side of it. Here's another one, sustainability. This is here in the UK, trying to move a university towards independence, right? Methane well, dual lateral and coal bed, 2 exits done. At 54 degrees, usually that's a Brownlee inclination if you're dealing with these methane wells, and short laterals for the most part, just over 600, between 600 and 700 meters. And same concept as what we just talked about with the other methane wells. They retrieved them out of the well bore and they're producing out of all the laterals. It's just simply drove down the cost of getting that reservoir, and it is providing a cleaner energy source for the campus, alternatively compared to what they were doing. So another one in your backyard, that's a good story. So we will move on to open hole sidetracking, and I've got a couple more case histories on that, and that'll be done. But there's the concept of either using a diverter, sidetracking off cement, or just sidetracking off a inclined well bore. So if you're out in the lateral, there's a high chance that you're not calling out cement, you're not calling out a whipstock, you're just low siding your motor going. Some of the laterals we talked about on the coal bed, 18,000 meter, they do just that. But in the case where you're looking at, yeah,
I'm sorry, because if you go back to the previous slides, where you going back before. So did you say you're running casing in these laterals?
through the main bore, they're doing natural completion or dropping off out into the lateral. So they're not running casing back up into the main bore.
Yeah, so these laterals are just open up.
What's that?
The laterals are open up.
They can be. They can have something inside of them as long as you're not running. They can have any type of completion you want, but it doesn't necessarily, generally speaking, but you would not run it back up through the window into the casing.
No, because you've got otherwise we've got five casing strings.
Yeah.
Tubing strings trying to
Yeah.
fill each other.
Yeah. So it's the level of this, all these junctions are level 2s. Yeah, which is normally the case in coal bed methane. Like the actual where you cut the windows in that coal is usually competent enough to where you don't have to case it off.
Okay. So you've got no way of shutting things in other than running a
Close.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's me and it wasn't questions.
Keep them coming, I like it. So when you look at curve or vertical, cement always becomes an option to sidetrack and open hole. We've already talked about it with the section milling side of things where you have to wait for the plug to set up, got time drill off of it, and if it doesn't work, you're kind of rinse and repeat. From the standpoint of the problems with doing cement plugs are if you're deep, Your hole size is usually small, you can usually use a competent plug, but in a lot of cases, your cement won't set up to be harder than the formation. That can be troublesome, right? It's always gonna take the path of least resistance. If you're up hole where the formations don't have that high of a compressive strength, it's usually larger hole sizes and it's tougher to get competent plugs, especially when you're dealing with oil-based mud. So when you look at it from the standpoint of whipstocking, there's the thought process of, do you have to pump cement anyway? It separates things, and I'll explain why. But if you have to do a cement job for regulatory, or the operator just likes to pump cement across zones, whether they're required to or not, that's a cement type application. If you're sidetracking, say around a fish, and you don't need to isolate because you're already packed off and isolated, that's non-cement scenario, okay? But before I move on, I always say this because it's tried and true. If you're close to the casing shoe and you have the option to exit the casing, you always take that. And for me, relatively speaking, it's what you can drill out below that shoe in one day. So if it's 1,000 feet, for me, if you're within 1,000 foot of the casing, you take the casing exit because the risk profile is so tight, like we talked about. You do not get that in open hole. The success rates aren't that high. So same concept with the case hole. There's plenty of different systems out there that you can deploy on mills, cutting structure, running tool. Usually the toughest thing with open hole sidetracking when you're looking at whipstocks is your hole reasonably engaged? And that's say 5 to 6 centimeters over drilled OD, something to that effect. But everything about open hole whipstocks are hole condition dependent. You have to be able to get the systems to depth, right? So wellbore prep runs, they become more critical, and the anchors themselves are set up for catching larger hole ranges, just because of the environment. It's not casing. So they're limited on functionality on doing low side exits and things of that nature. So that's always something to consider when you're talking about it. But the advantages of using these systems are that it'll give you a fixed point of mechanical kickoff relative to a cement plug, where you hope for the best and you get kicked off at some depth, right? Here's an example. There's plenty of literature out there from multiple different operators and service companies that talk about time saved for vertical kickoffs relative to cement. And just summarizing the case history here about, you know, a project where they did X many wells off cement, then X many off of a whipstock. The long and short of what you come up with across all the SPE papers and the studies is around 2.5 days. So even on a land rig, that can be a significant amount of time saved, plus you're going to production quicker, right? So one thing that also should be said before we get into the case history is simply this. Because it requires reasonable hole conditions to run whipstocks, if you chase cement plugs on a well, you very quickly lose the ability to fall back on that option. And I've seen it happen in multiple basins where someone calls and says, hey, looking for a whip, and it's too late. You're not going to be able to get it in there anymore because the holes come apart. And in the worst case scenario, you'll lose a whole section because of it. So this is a perfect example of the trip savings that we talked about earlier in cased hole, only this is open hole. So conventionally speaking, there's always been the technology to set whipstocks in open hole, but if it's a cement application where you're required to or you choose to pump cement, it's always been 2 trips. So the technology now exists where you can combine the run of doing a cement job and also deploying the system on cutting structure. That's only been around now for 2 or 3 years. So if you were in a cement scenario, you always had to go in there and pump your cement job, run a cased hole system, or run an open hole system where you can cement and then come back with a dedicated kickoff BHA. So just 2 more case histories and then we're wrapped up. In this particular case,
So if you're running it the 2 together, you're waiting on cement.
no. That's the benefit of the whip. You're not using the cement for an anchor. You're just using the standalone anchor. You're just simply pumping the cement for like a regulatory requirement. So you don't,
You don't care about integrity, you're not going to disturb it with drilling operations.
no, in this particular case, as shown on the screen, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that way, that element will provide isolation too. So there won't be flow past it to disturb the cement below it. But usually with these type of operations, they will pump cement over everything, including the whipstock. And then whatever's above the whipstock or across the whipstock comes back into the shaker's plant. So you don't want to have, 1,000 foot of cement, but 50 to 100 foot's not uncommon. You don't wait for it to set up. You just go. That's the benefit. So you don't have the dedicated cement trip time. You're doing it through the whipstock. You run tubing sacrificially. You don't have the time associated with waiting for the cement, and you certainly don't have the time spent time drilling. So it's every step of the operation, you're trimming off all the session time. Great question.
We talked about onshore rates, but offshore spread rates are $1 million a day now.
In certain areas of the world, but I think if you look at time not producing, you quickly get anywhere offshore to add up that amount, right? Because all those spreads in certain places may not be that high, depending on what type of rig it is. But the whole time that they're drilling, they're not producing that well. So to me, that's got to be added into the equation. You start getting almost everywhere up over that magic number, right? So in this particular case, not a super large hole size, 149.2 millimeter lateral install China. They had been trying to do lateral low side exits. In this particular area, it was unsuccessful. In a lot of areas, it's very successful. In this particular case, they had plenty of offset wells that were taking them 12 days to kick off cement. Now, it's quite a shock that you would actually ever get off cement or get back down to the cement plugs after a 12-day operation. If you're in a non-competent formation, you've lost that section for sure. So in this particular case, similar concept, 4 days, open hole, just a little bit longer than the 3.5 we talked about globally, generally speaking, but another step change in this particular field. So if they can go in and save 8 days and all the risk associated with leaving the open hole exposed that long, it's a no-brainer. So kind of incorporated into the profile of drilling the well from a risk reduction standpoint, but also a step change in what they would do moving forward in that field. So it wasn't even a thought to go and pump cement anymore. It was set more of these. Here's one that talks exactly about what we just discussed. Cutting structure, sacrificial tubing and cement. And in this particular case, it was to bypass a radioactive source. So anytime you have that scenario, you have to pump red cement, or some colored cement, so that if you drill into it, hey, radioactive. But also more importantly, in a lot of these situations, they will put a deflection device down there and P&A the well and move off. It's done. But in that situation, you would install some sort of a deflector. Probably doesn't need to be anchored, doesn't certainly need to be orientated, and it doesn't need to be new equipment. But in this case, they got approval to set that deflector, pump the right cement, but also use the deflector to sidetrack to continue well construction. So it checks a lot of boxes as far as being a very unique job. But in this case, that newer technology system was used, 22.2 millimeter hole. Obviously avoid setting the multiple plugs. They did it all in one trip, ran probably a couple 100 meters of sacrificial tubing, pumped the red cement job, and then used the system to actually sidetrack off of 2 hours to get kicked off 20 to 30 feet. So that goes to show you how quickly you can get off first day of time drilling operation. So utilize the existing well down to kickoff point, bypassed source, checked all the boxes from a regulatory standpoint, and continue well construction. Huge success story, right? And again, best practice in similar open hole contingency scenarios, not from the standpoint of this operator thought they were going to be leaving sources in the hole on a regular basis, But the concept of pilot well or sidetracking fish, this is the way to go relative to plugging cement. Right, so.
Was that some natural radiation or is it man-made from previous
Yeah,
drilling?
storage in the hole, meaning, their whatever mechanism they were logging the well with. Yeah, definitely man-made. Someone left a tool in there that they weren't supposed to, and they couldn't fish it. So when that situation happens, you are obligated, this was in the US, right? So I don't know how many fishing runs is required, but it's a lot more than you'd like. You've got to make every effort to try to get that. And you can't, even though you can go around that quicker, you have to check that box, good honest effort, and someone has to say, yeah, you tried. And then you can go about doing your plugging and abandoning or continuing well construction. But that's not a normal thing. I've only been involved in maybe 3 of those in my 15 years. It's thankfully, right? So yeah, no, good question. So to summarize everything, we talked about, efficiency gains and whipstocks. They're a reliable option for almost every drilling scenario that's out there. Because they're so efficient, it's changed the way people will not only do a well design from the casing sizes that they may use, but also from the newer technologies out there that help with well construction process altogether. Knowing that you have an efficient, low risk operation in your back pocket to go around it, right? So that's huge. And then of course, reentries and planned multilaterals, the whole thought of getting more production, whether it's behind pipe or it's a reservoir that you plan to drill, but saving the cost of all the well construction down to kickoff point, and also all the surface cost involved with a different pad. All the infrastructure that it takes to get there, and dropping the carbon footprint of the whole operation involved as well, right? So it falls into that line of going green, but it's a different concept of how you're doing it. And then of course, open hole whipstocks and the new technology there are an absolutely viable option, can save you 2.5 days in some applications. But if you're close to the casing shoe, you take that route first. That's all I've got.
All right, so Peter's going to start with the question.
I like it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean,
So, I'm not an engineer at all, so this is all completely beyond me. So it's a really simple question. I've heard of horizontal drilling before. So is this the same thing, or is this sort of slanted sidetracking? Is that a different process completely?
So all the whipstock process allows you to do is get your next BHA diverted. So it doesn't matter whether you install that in a vertical, curve, or horizontal. It's just using a downhole anchored wedge to, if you're encasing, to divert mills, to cut a window in the direction you want to go at any inclination. And then that, of course, will allow you to come back in with your drilling BHA and do anything you want to do. So you don't, let's just say vertical reentry well, you're going back in there and I'm going to exit that thing at 10,000 meters, or not that deep, 5,000 meters. You don't necessarily need to turn that into a horizontal well. You just need to cut a hole in the casing or bypass the bore that's there to then go drill either horizontal or vertical to complete it, the next leg. Okay. You do not have to, the concept doesn't mean you have to go lateral with it. You could go vertical. It's just getting you deflected enough to get around. Yeah. Yeah.
when you cut a hole in the casing, then you create a weak point. When you do your preparations for milling and sidetracking, do you look at any geomechanical issues regarding the rock?
Yes, only if you're gonna multilat the well and you are deciding between a level 2 or higher. So if you plan to just go in there and re-enter that well and abandon the section below you, No. Because then you treat it like any other well where, you know, that's your casing point.
Yeah.
Formation integrity test. And of course, before you do the usually before you cut the window, they'll do an integrity test on the casing to make sure uphole it's good. If you plan to do a multi-lat and still produce from below you, what matters at that point is the formation at the junction where you cut the window sound? If it's not, and you're worried about collapse or something that would hinder production on that lateral, then you have to run casing at a minimum across it. You start moving up junctions. When you move up junction level from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, the risk goes up, the trip count goes up, and the cost goes up. But that's okay if it's still economical. So usually when you're talking level 2s, land-based systems, very minimalistic, low-cost operations. Anywhere you go and you say, I'm gonna go cut a window, you're grabbing off the shelf equipment and you're now re-entering the well and turning it into a multi-lat or just a standalone, but you're not running pipe back up into the casing. That's, I mean, it's as simple as it gets. But if you can't do that and you have to start stepping up a level, it comes at a cost. But you may have to, right? In certain areas like the North Sea, there's not possible to do level 2s or 3s or 4s for that matter. They're pretty much all level 5s, where you gain integrity at that point. So it literally doesn't matter what the formation does because you're isolated from it.
And does that apply to how that cement job is around the area of the casing? Because you touched upon that.
Yeah.
Point, and I should have picked up at the time. Can you talk around, if you've got a poor cement job around the area where you, and about the area where you're operating?
Ooh, I like it. So statistically, you lose, when you look at an unsupported junction, the getting usable windows is absolutely a high probability of success. But you lose about 15 to 20% of the chance of getting it done in one trip if you don't have cement. And the reason why would be you leave early and you don't get a complete window. Now that doesn't mean it's the end of the world. It just may mean that you have to make an extra trip in there with a stiffer milling BHA to clean that leftover bit of casing. The other side effect of having no cement is that you will come out more under gauge than what you normally would, meaning your mills lose cutting structure very quickly because of the vibration. So it wouldn't be uncommon in a non-cement type application to come out of the hole and the mills are way out of gauge. Again, it's defined. You know what the risk profile is with or without cement. You're still likely going to get a usable window, and you know what the cost of the extra mill run is and what the time associated with it is. So although it shifts the profile of the risk for the well, it's known. So anytime someone says, oh, can I get a window unsupported? The data is still there because everyone exits unsupported casing, not as often as supported, but there are certain basins around the world where it's likely there's not going to be cement. And usually if that happens, you've got to check other boxes too, like formation integrity tests, once you get the window cut. So philosophically, some of the operators look at when you cut the window like a really big perf. They'll do a squeeze job right there at the window, using the window to get your cement into the annulus. And they'll do a normal cement job that way. And then they'll come back in with, if the window's complete, they'll use rock bit to get kicked off of and go about drilling. If the window isn't complete from the standpoint of mills were under gauge, or you did get the window, you jumped early, then that's a perfect opportunity to now use the squeeze window to finish that up and run another set of mills across it before you pick up the PDC one PHA. Is that it? Is that?
That's good for that one.
Okay.
Do you want a question?
Yes, what are the levels? You mentioned this, it's a level 1, it's a level 2, it's a level, what are those?
Okay. So a level 1 is open hole off open hole. at the junction. So meaning that, you can have completions that are in the open hole sections, but they just can't be where the actual window is. They can be outside it and below it. That's still level one, or they can be all left open. Level two is what we showed a lot of up there, is you've now cut a window in the casing, and as long as you don't run anything back up into the actual casing, meaning you can dump it off 10 foot outside the window, that junction is now level two. Cased hole, open hole. 3 is when you run steel back up into the casing. But you also have access down below you, but you didn't cement it. So no one really does a 3, because a 4 is if you cement it. So everyone always usually checks the box of a 4, because it's all you gotta do is cement to get there. And the one thing that people always mistake is that a 4 will not provide you isolation through the junction alone. So you wouldn't be able to do a frac job across the junction if it's a level 3 or 4. You have to be able to isolate to control the pressure. But that's fine, you can do that with completions, but the junction itself will be a 4. A 5 is taking it a step further to where the actual junction itself has pressure integrity. And that's usually like offshore North Sea type stuff. 4s and 5s, they can achieve a level 5 by messing around with the completions to make sure that they, packers below, packers above, packers in the main bore. So that's a level 5, right? So it's just, but the main thing you have to consider is simply this: as you step up levels, it's more trips, more risk, and absolutely more cost. Like, I don't see a level 5 being done on land anytime soon because the price tag's too big. Yeah.
Okay, that just fits straight into my question. Okay, so one of the slides you put up was a 5 lateral.
The cold one, yeah.
Okay, it was probably. Let's assume that was a shower well. Okay, let's take it away.
Okay.
And let's say it was designed to be a 70-stage frac job, per lateral, different benches, walkout CBNA or something like that. Talk me through how that works.
I'll give you one example, because there's probably multiple examples on how an operator can handle it, right? But I'll use an example of what operators would do regularly on a shell well where they're gonna frac. So, well construction on first one. It doesn't need to be this way, but I'll walk you through one step, and then if we want to go through another, you can. But well construction of first lateral standalone wellbore, complete it no differently than what you want to. So frack it. After you're done fracking it, you would plug it off, isolate it, come up, cut a window, well construction on that process. You're now at that point isolated from below. You could go ahead, if they drop that one off on the outside of the junction, they could run that completion in on a frac string and do the frac there, and then come in and remove, once frac, they could remove plugs on the lower well too, like a workover rig, to where you could produce both. Now, if there were different pressure gradients, things would get more complicated. You may have to wait to produce one back till the other gradient goes to the same pressure, or you can start getting creative by upping the junction level to say like a 3, to where you have access back to both a pipe, say a 4, and cement back up. Now, on some of the systems that are out there, and you have to actually physically create the junction, meaning that it's hard to do this without slides, right? But you got your lower well, your lower section that's already been fracked and it's ready to produce. The upper one, all that would be behind pipe and cement. And then when you're ready, you would come back in and cut a window back down through your liner into the main bore to get access to below. Now, you lose drift size when you do that, but you still have the ability to get in there. And if you did do a frac job, you could do a frac job, or just clean the plug out of the way to get access to the reserves there. That's one of the ways to do it. More trips, more costs, but not unreasonable to do that type of operation land. right? Things would get, if you could not do level twos, it's fair to say that you're limited on the number of laterals that you could drill and access. If it's twos, you could, sky's the limit. But when you start talking about, above a two, when you start having stuff in the main bore that restricts you from, then you're limited on the number of laterals that can be done. If you want production from the lower one, that doesn't limit you from abandoning and just, saving the cost of well construction down to every window. Which that's a thing, like that's happening worldwide in plenty of basins where people aren't necessarily saying, oh, I always want to be able to go and produce the lower one. It's that well needs to be P&A, but I'm going to utilize the structure there to cut a window and not have to do the vertical. And perhaps curve, it depends on where they're going to kick off, right?
Yeah, I had an eye in my mind to geothermal wells, and that's why I asked the question. Not the kind of other stuff, which is all cased.
Yeah,
I was just generally trying to look at the way we're going to do these EGS type systems in order to try and extract most of the heat. So that's kind of what I was thinking of.
no, understood. It just depends in those particular cases what, closed loop, open loop. But the concept that has been floated out there for some of the companies that are looking at the high temp geothermal loop systems are anywhere around a dozen legs. But it hasn't been set in stone how they'll do it, right?
It takes,
Yeah.
You mentioned, I did not misunderstand, but sorry, the one I say. You mentioned, and correct me if I misunderstood, but I think you mentioned that in some cases the decision to either fish or do sidetrack, it will be a regulatory requirements, US.
Only in the case of, there's probably more, but the two that come to mind are insurance requirements. So if you leave an RSS in the hole and someone bought insurance on it, the insurance company is going to want you to try to get it out with X many runs. But that's all agreed upon before the tools go in the ground. That's standard practice, right? And then there's also the thought of sources in the hole, which I had one example up there, but that's not a very common thing. But if you leave a source in the hole, you're going to be required to make more attempts. But if it's neither of those situations, or if it's one of those situations and you get to the point where now you satisfied the run count, and the decision is now the operators to continue to fish or sidetrack, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should always go to sidetrack. It just, I guess the point of it is that it shifts the thought process and how long you're willing to sidetrack, because there's the other things that come into play, the factors that come into making that decision have made it more economical to do a sidetrack quicker. So if I were to say you're giving up 1,000 feet and it's unknown if you're going to be able to get this fish out in, let's just say, 5 days. Statistically speaking, if we're saying 97% of the time, you will be back to drilling in 3.5 days, but on top of it, you can re-drill that lost hole section in a day. It's going to make you think, and that's a coin flip. What's the cost of the equipment I'm leaving in the hole needs to be taken into account? But you see the thought process. Everyone used to fish and fish and fish because there wasn't a reliable, it's not a guarantee that we're going to get sidetracked. But nowadays, it's very close to that. And so if you can say, hey, you're in this scenario, and this is your alternative, and this is very well known, it just shifts the thought process on when you're willing to go to this versus stick with this. It doesn't mean the answer is always, in some cases you leave a fish in the hole and it's very easy to get. It'll take you a trip or two. the logical thing to do is to go pull the fish. But if you cross the threshold of throwing good money after bad money, you can get to the decision that we're gonna leave that be and go around it pretty quickly. You know,
Thank you.
Any other questions? There are none from the audience, the virtual audience. They're all watching the game with the match. What is, who knows the school? What's the school? Do you know the school? No? Oh, okay. That's good. Literally got knocked out. Thanks so much. Thank you so much indeed, Thomas. That could be really, really, really interesting.
Oh, I've got the score here. Should I tell you or let me watch it?
did I follow up yet?
Yeah, good stuff.